Welcome back, everyone, to our symposium. And I just want to say we've heard some really wonderful papers today, and I really appreciate all of you for putting together such great papers. And we have another one coming. But before I introduce Kris's paper, I just want to take a minute to once again thank the Tolkien Society for giving us the use of their Zoom account so that we're able to do this seminar virtually. So we really appreciate that. And thanks to Luke as well for the technical assistance. All right, so Kris, it's great to see you. And Kris is speaking today on the poetry of Geoffrey Bache Smith. I just realized I don't know how to pronounce his middle name, with special note of Tolkienian context. So thank you, Kris, and hopefully you can educate me on the proper pronunciation of his name.
Your guess is as good as mine. I learned everything I know from the Tolkien movie in 2019. No, kidding. All right. Okay, I'm assuming you can see my screen.
We can, thank you.
Very good. And here we go. This paper grew out of two things: my PhD thesis work at the University of Glasgow under the direction of Dr. Dimitra Fimi, and conversations with John Garth beginning in Oxford in the summer of 2019. And I'm grateful to both of them for their generosity and insights. The Old Irish Voyage of Bran concerns an otherworld voyage where, in one scene, Bran meets Manannán mac Lir, an Irish mythological figure often interpreted as a sea god. Tolkien mentions Bran in his poem The Nameless Land, first written in 1924 and published in 1927, by which time he had taken up academic appointments at both the universities of Leeds and Oxford. But Tolkien was likely to have been exposed to the Voyage of Bran back in 1911, during his first year as an Oxford undergraduate student. In December 1911, Tolkien returned to Birmingham over his winter break from Exeter College to see his friends and take part in their production of Richard Sheridan's play, The Rivals, which Anna mentioned earlier today. During rehearsals for the play, Tolkien stayed, as he often did, with the Gilson family. The TCBS, or Tea Club and Barrovian Society, the name that his friends gave to their social circle, was well represented in the play. Tolkien played the role of Mrs. Malaprop, the linguistically challenged aunt. Rob Gilson produced the play and took on the role of Captain Absolute. Their friend Christopher Wiseman was Sir Anthony Absolute. T.K. Barnsley was Bob Acres, and a new member of the TCBS, Geoffrey Bache Smith, played the role of Falkland. Smith was not a founding member of the TCBS, despite his portrayal as such in the 2019 Tolkien film. Born on 18th of October, 1894, Smith was nearly 3 years Tolkien's junior and entered King Edward's School in January 1905, the same month as Tolkien's younger brother, Hilary. According to Skull and Hammond, Smith seems to have been taken up by Rob Gilson and Christopher Wiseman in the autumn term of 1911. And in a way, he filled a gap that Tolkien left when he went up to Oxford. Skull and Hammond write that, like Tolkien, Smith earned distinction as a King Edward scholar and was the recipient of school prizes. By all evidence, he was witty and intelligent, a promising poet, and enthusiastic about literature and history. That's Skull and Hammond. In the same month as the production of The Rivals, December 1911, the King Edward School Chronicle, a period written and produced mainly by the boys themselves, published a mock university entrance exam, the Camford and Oxbridge examination paper in advanced mathematics, as a parody of the real Oxford and Cambridge University entrance exams. And I'm grateful to John Garth for bringing this paper to my attention. In his time as a King Edward student, Tolkien had served as the Chronicle's editor, and due to the content and humorous style, he is known or strongly suspected of penning a variety of its reports. Following in Tolkien's footsteps, Gilson and Wiseman became the editors of the Chronicle after Tolkien's departure for Oxford. The mock examination paper in the December 1911 issue was then published on their watch, and they probably also wrote it. The entire exam is penned in the exuberant and witty style characteristic of the TCBS. Garth writes, the TCBS reveled in a degree of outlandishness. Their humor was quickfire and often sophisticated. Their interests and talents were many. All the questions on the mock exam are impossible to answer, such as plotting the fictional El Dorado on a map. Wiseman's fingerprints are on questions number 5 and 6, which require mathematical calculations. The exam also includes several references to Celtic matters. There is mention of, and Demetra, I really apologize for my Welsh pronunciation, Llywarch Hen, one of 4 great legendary bards of early Welsh poetry, and Llanfair Pwll Gwyngyll, a village on the Isle of Anglesey, whose full name, which I will not even attempt to pronounce, is the longest place name in Europe. These might be the contributions, these Celtic questions, of the new TCBS member, G.B. Smith. Smith was interested in Celtic language and literature, and his nickname on the rugby pitch was the Prince of Wales. Smith shared with Tolkien a delight in the ancient Welsh stories of King Arthur and the Mabinogion. They also shared a love of the Welsh language, and when Smith died in the Great War in 1916, he bequeathed Tolkien a number of books on Welsh language and literature. Question number 3 of the mock examination concerns a poetic quatrain in Old Irish from the anonymous Voyage of Bran. The source used for the quotation was the only published edition and English translation available in 1911, Kuno Meyer's Voyage of Bran, son of Beable to the Land of the Living. In the stanza reproduced in the mock examination, which is on the screen, both the Irish and the English translation are Kuno Meyer's. Bran has just encountered Manannán mac Lir on the ocean. Manannán is on his way to Ireland to beget the future hero, Mongan. Manannán mac Lir says that where Bran sees ocean waves, he sees a flowery plain on which he can drive his chariot. Krista Maria Loeffler notes that this relativity of water features to land features is typical of medieval descriptions of Irish marine otherworlds. Manannán calls the plain Magmel, or the happy plain. Magmel is certainly an otherworld because, as the quatrain which was published in the 1911 Chronicle shows, the trees are in flower, as in spring, in fruit, as in summer, and their leaves are turning, as in autumn, all at the same time. Supporting the contention that G.B. Smith was the author of the question on the mock exam to do with the Voyage of Bran quotation is evidence from his own poetry, which was edited by Tolkien and Wiseman in a small memorial volume, A Spring Harvest, published in 1918 after the Great War. In his introductory note, Tolkien writes, the poems of this book were written at very various times, and it's difficult to tell when some of them might be written except for a few in the volume. However, Tolkien specifically says that the poem Wind Over the Sea was written as early as 1910. That is, Tolkien knows it was an early poem of Smith's and perhaps already in existence before December 1911. This is interesting because Wind Over the Sea includes references which echo the Voyage of Bran. And here is an excerpt. Out of the gathering darkness crashes a wind from the ocean, rushing with league-long paces over the plain of waters, driving the clouds and the breakers before it in sudden commotion. Who are these on the wind? Riders and riderless horses, riders, the great ones that have been and are, and those to come shall be. These are the children of might, life's champions and history's forces. Both the Voyage of Bran and Smith's Wind Over the Sea take place on the ocean, and Smith recapitulates Manannán's flowery plain with his own plain of waters. Oops. There is also the horse imagery. Manannán discusses glistening seahorses, his chariot, and many steeds on the surface of the water. This is matched in Smith's poem with images of driving and rushing with league-long paces. Smith asks, who are these on the wind? Riders and riderless horses. In both works, galloping horses are used as poetic descriptions of sea foam whipped up by the wind on the water. Additionally, both poems mention future heroes. Manannán is going to Ireland to beget the future hero Mongan, who he says will be famous through the long ages. Mighty in battle, a champion, a valiant hero. And Smith's writers shall also be mighty champions and famous in history. The foam horses of Manannán and Smith should remind us of what? That's right, the ford of Bruinen in Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring. Frodo on horseback is being hotly pursued by the Black Riders. As he crosses the ford, the Black Riders urge their horses into the water. At that moment, there came a roaring and a rushing, a noise of loud waters rolling many stones. Dimly, Frodo saw the river below him rise, and down along its course there came a plumed cavalry of waves. White flames seemed to Frodo to flicker on their crests, and he half fancied that he saw amid the water white riders upon white horses with frothing manes. Once again, we have a scene which takes place on water. Riding on water is related to riding on land, and galloping horses are used as poetic descriptions of foam-whipped waves. Smith's poem, Wind Over the Sea, has a lot in common with the Manning and McLear scene from Kuno Meyer's Voyage of Bran, and Tolkien thought Smith's poem had been written as early as 1910. If true, then Smith's familiarity with Bran preceded the December 1911 mock exam in the King Edward School Chronicle, making him the best candidate so far to be the author of the Bran question and probably the 2 Welsh questions on the exam. But it's harder to argue simply by looking at one poem that Smith's poetry influenced the writings of Tolkien, but there is more to consider. In Smith's numinous poem, Legend, a tattered monk appears from the wood behind a monastery and tells the brethren that he had strayed there to hear the divine music of a sweet bird who sang to him of blessed shores and golden. None of the brothers recognizes the tattered monk, and he recognizes none of them, though he claims to be from that monastery, having left it merely 1 hour before. The eldest of the monks recalls a story from his youth of a monk who disappeared 50 years before that. And when one of the brothers goes to the cell where they left the strange monk to pray, all the brother finds is the tattered habit and dust, as if a body crumbled to the grave. Smith's Legend closely follows the plot of an inset story in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's long narrative poem, The Golden Legend. The bird which sings to Longfellow's monk Felix sings of the heavenly city Elysian, while Smith's monk speaks of high heaven in conjunction with the medieval motif of the other world or the earthly paradise, with blessed shores and golden beyond the western sea. Aisling Byrne, in her study of other worlds, notes that medieval writers often mix imagery redolent of Eden and New Jerusalem quite freely with their other world accounts. Longfellow's Felix does not crumble to dust as Smith's monk does. In this aspect, Smith may be echoing the Welsh legend of Sion ap Shenkin. Like the monk Felix, Sion sits under a tree to hear a little bird sing and returns home to find that decades have passed. When Sion steps across the threshold of his old farmhouse, he crumbles to ash. A version of Sion ap Shenkin is included in Folklore of West and Mid Wales, published in 1911. And a new edition of Longfellow's The Golden Legend was published in London around 1914, both of which correspond to Smith's active years as a poet. Distant islands over the sea, the disjunction of time and turning to ash also echo the voyage of Bran. One of Bran's companions steps foot again on Irish soil after having been away from home longer than he realizes, and he instantly turns to ash. As John Garth notes, Smith's monk had set off on his stroll 100 years previously and strayed into a timeless otherworld. But the bird's song is Tolkien's too. The shores of Faerie may not be heaven, but they are illuminated by it. That's in Garth's Great War. Smith's words, beyond the Western Sea, would later be used by Tolkien, for example, in his elvish hymn to Elbereth Gilthoniel, O Queen Beyond the Western Seas, and in Gimli's paean to Durin, who now beyond the Western Seas have passed away. Similarity is not proof of influence, but we can recognize once again an exactness of phrasing. This is a major motif in Smith's poetry as well. He repeatedly mentions a far isle set in the Western Sea, and quiet isles beyond death's starry west. Tolkien also situated his land of bliss, Valinor, in the west beyond the seas. In the Arundel poems he began to write in 1914, the very time which Tolkien and Smith were students together at Oxford, and a time in which they were known to have shared their poetry with each other and commented on it. Tolkien had read The Voyage of Arundel aloud on the 27th of November, 1914, to Exeter College's Essay Club. G.B. Smith also read the poem and asked his friend what it was really about. Tolkien replied, "I don't know, but I'll try to find out." In his earliest extant version of Tolkien's Voyage of Arundel, the mariner launches his bark like a silver spark from the golden fading sand. Down the sunlit breath of day's fiery death, he sped from Westerland. There are several echoes here with Smith's imagery and language in Legend: the golden shores, the sunset, and far western lands. Smith joined Tolkien at Oxford in October 1913, and with their shared interests, including the composition of poetry, Smith's arrival in Oxford was the start of a more meaningful friendship with Tolkien, says John Garth. And yet, before we too hastily claim a case of copying or influence in one direction or the other, Garth observes elsewhere that the motif of going west was in fact quite conventional imagery at the time for death, at the time that Smith wrote his poems. As an example, years before he ever met Tolkien, C.S. Lewis employed just such imagery in his 1919 poem, Hesperus. Lewis writes, "I would follow Hesperus the bright, to seek beyond the western wave, his garden of delight." So like Tolkien with his evening star, Arundel, Lewis writes of Hesperus as the evening star beyond the waters of the outer sea. So were Tolkien and Smith simply participating in a general cultural movement of the time, or were they influencing each other's poetry? This we still can't say with any certainty, but there is more to consider. In his book, The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, John Garth proposes a major and largely overlooked influence on Tolkien's world building was Fridtjof Nansen's 1911 In Northern Mists. The author's view of Vinland the Good, a descriptive name for a land west across the sea, which is mentioned in 2 Norse sagas. Nansen argued that the way in which Vinland was portrayed in the sagas was as a fairyland with magical or marvelous inhabitants. Nansen accepts that Norse sailors from Iceland did reach the coast of America, but that their accounts became thoroughly mixed up with pre-existing legends and of the lands of bliss in the West. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, when Leif Erikson sails from Norway to Greenland in the year 999, he's driven off course and for a long time drifted about in the sea and came upon countries of which before he had no suspicion. There were self-sown wheat fields and vines grew there. Later in the year 1003, the Icelander Thorfinn Karlsefni sets out to found a colony in the new lands. This expedition too found grapes and self-sown wheat. Nansen says that the sure signs of wineland are the self-sown wheat and the vine. But the same description has been used of other paradisical lands across the Western Sea. For example, in the early 7th century by Isidore of Seville, speaking of the classical Fortunate Isles, and in the Grape Island visited by the Irish Saint Brendan in the 10th century Latin Navigatio Sancti Brendani. Nansen says similar resemblances are found with other Irish legends, so many in fact that they cannot be explained as coincidences. Also, it's said of Wineland that no snow at all fell there, and the cattle were out in winter and fed themselves. But as early as the Odyssey of Homer, it said that the Elysian fields in the west on the borders of the earth, there is never snow, never winter, nor storm, nor streaming rain. Garth writes at Oxford in autumn 1914, as Tolkien was brewing up his first mythological ideas, he was also studying Thorfinn's saga. It was part of his special subject in Scandinavian philology, which he took up at Trinity Term 1913 with his switch to the English school. Garth argues that Tolkien's tutor, William Craigie, can hardly have failed to mention the Nansen controversy. Craigie had just published his own book on the topic of the Icelandic sagas, in which he defended the historical basis of the much discussed and disputed Vinland account. In brief notes listing ideas for tales to include his unfinished novel, The Lost Road, Tolkien jots a Norse story of ship burial, Vinland, and a number of scholars, including John Ratliff, Roger Echohawk, and John Garth, have made convincing associations between the primary world Vinland and Tolkien's mysterious land of Dorwinion, in which the Hobbit produces the heavy vintage of wine that gives the Elf King's butler and chief guard deep and pleasant dreams. The name Dorwinion can be translated as the land of youth or the land of wine, that is, the Irish Tir na Nog or the Norse Vinland. And if Nansen is correct, they're essentially the same thing. But Tolkien had mentioned Vinland earlier than in The Lost Road or as Dorwinion in The Hobbit. Addressing Corpus Christi College's Sundial Society at G.B. Smith's invitation on the 22nd of November 1914, Tolkien declared that reading the Finnish Kalevala was to feel like Columbus on a new continent or Thorfinn in Vinland the Good. Smith's poem, The Wind of the Darkness, also demonstrates an interest in the same subject. And here is an excerpt. The far isle that neither knoweth change of season nor time's increase, where is plenty and no man soweth, calling to strife that shall end in peace. Not quite. In his Plenty and No Man Soweth, Smith evokes images of fertility and self-sown fields of wheat, a land where no snow falls because the seasons do not change, unlike the real world eastern coast of North America, which Craigie had championed. It is an image which at once evokes Norse Finland, Irish Tir na Nog, and the classical Fortunate Isles. The preoccupations of Smith's poetry with repeated images of far islands, golden shores, which neither experience time nor the change of seasons, where there's plenty and no man soweth, are the very same motifs that Tolkien used beginning in his 1914 and 15 Arundel poems and throughout his writing career. Garth writes, G.B. Smith was closely attentive to Tolkien's vision and in some measure shared it despite his avowed antipathy to Romanticism. In February 1916, Smith wrote to Tolkien that the TCBS believe in your work, we others, and recognize with pleasure our own finger in it. Where exactly Smith's finger appears in Tolkien's work might be revealed by such close comparisons as these, but more work needs to be done. Examination of other poems by both Smith and Tolkien, looking at their existing letters to one another and other contemporary poetry and culture. But for now, we must be open to the idea that Smith and Tolkien did more than read each other's poems and comment on them. They were concerned with the same poetic images and ideas. And in the end, we may need to reappraise Smith's poetry and the contexts in which Middle-earth was born. Thank you. And there's my very tiny works cited.
So thank you very much, Kris. That was great.
Thank you.
All right, well, we have time for some questions for Kris, and I see that there's already a question in the Q&A, which I'll read out, but let me first just invite all of you to please type your questions in the Q&A. Okay, so this is, Kris, this one's from Doug Anderson, and he says, there is no known authority for the pronunciation of GBS's middle name.
Thank you.
Wow, that's good to hear. I have heard Bache, Bach, Back, and even Bache. Oddly, there was an American poet anterior to GBS named Henry Bache Smith, but I've never heard it pronounced either, and Harry was no relation to GBS. Wow, thank you for that, Doug. That's really good to know. Okay,
Thanks,
so again, please post your questions to the Q&A, and in the meantime, while we're waiting for you to type those, I just want to take a minute to mention that the Journal for Tolkien Research has a section on conference papers. So for those of you who are not interested in perhaps taking the ideas you've expressed here and working them up more fully into an article, but would just be interested in just publishing your conference paper as is, the section on the section for conference papers in the Journal for Tolkien Research is a great place to look.
Just make sure you mark that it's a conference paper when you submit it, because I accidentally did that once and it went to peer review and it was not ready for peer review.
Oh no. Yes, very, very important point. Okay. Great, I see that Chris Larson has posted the link in the chat, so that's great.
All right, so I covered all the bases and you guys have no questions. Awesome, that's easy.
Well, I have a question for you, actually, just really not a particularly scholarly one, but just obviously you've worked with G.B. Smith's poetry, and I'm just curious what your impression is of it.
Well, it's definitely young and immature and very exuberant with rhyming, which I would have loved to have seen what he would have done had he had the chance to grow up and continue to develop. I think it's very comparable in level of maturity with Tolkien's early work at that time. So if you kind of put side by side the Arundel poems and G.B. Smith stuff from Spring Harvest, there are commonalities of theme. There's also commonalities of sort of rhyme schemes and the kind of bouncy meter that that maybe less experienced poets kind of use.
Good, thank you. So we have a question here from Nancy. which is the popular poem Crossing the Bar, often memorized in school, is an example of sailing into the West as an analogy of death.
Exactly. And there have been some works on comparing that with Bilbo's last song, where he also goes beyond the harbor bar. And there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on Tennyson and Tolkien that somebody could look into.
Right. I mean, Tennyson was pretty ubiquitous in Tolkien's lifetime. So,
and their ideas and themes cross over quite a bit.
Oh yeah, right. Idylls of the King. Right.
Right.
Okay. There's a question here from Doug Anderson, who says, Kris, do you see a change in GBS's verse from early to later? I tend to think the later stuff is less interesting.
Even Wiseman and Tolkien said that about his later stuff when they were trying to put it together. I would love to be able to go back to the Bodleian someday and read some of the letters that are there between them. My only access to them was through John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War. But in there, they discuss how after he got to the war, of course, his poems got darker, as you would expect, but then they didn't feel that they were as good a quality. All we know from A Spring Harvest of dating is that the last third are poems from the war that Tolkien put there. And then just that one that he says, I think was early as 1910. And then there are two that Smith submitted for a poetry prize when he was at Oxford. And we know what the themes were those years. So we know that those were, I think, from 14 and 15. So there's like 3 of the early poems we can kind of date with some certainty, at least their origins. He continued to work on them. And then the last poems were from the war. And it was also Smith and Wiseman and Tolkien's view that those were not as accomplished.
Thank you.
Of course, he's writing them in the trenches,
Right. All right. We have a question here from Merlin. He says, I haven't read John Garth's recent book yet, but In Northern Mists sounded familiar, and a quick search reminded me that this is the text Tolkien cited in On Fairy Stories about He-Brisil. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. So many avenues for Tolkien studies spring from such brief references. Great paper, Kris.
Thank you, Merlin. John Garth was able to speak with Christopher Tolkien about this book, and did his father own it? And apparently he did, and Christopher still had the copy, and he was able to flip open the cover and see that Tolkien inscribed his 1921. So we know at least from 1921 on, Tolkien had his own copy of In Northern Mists. John's theory is that he would have been at least heard it mentioned by W.A. Craigie in his classes, if not have read it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful talk. So thanks once again, Kris. It was so great to hear.